Welcome back. This is author Jason Lee Willis reading The Alchemist Tomb, Part 3, The North Sea. Chapter 14, Aberdeen, Scotland, 1852. Antoine Clement watched from the deck of the steamship Argyll as its sister ship headed south from the port of Aberdeen. So far, Stuart's plan had gone off without a hitch, but seeing his friend departing for the Mediterranean filled him with deep sadness, which in turn fueled his rage for even being in the situation. In his life, the Canadian Cree had seen enough ships to not be overly impressed by the current vessel. The Argyll was powered by a single steam engine. The 100-foot sleek vessel still had two thin masts on both sides of the 20-foot tall smokestack, yet it didn't rise more than 20 feet from the waterline. Like Stuart's vessel, it was enough ship to jump from port to port along the North Sea, but not to cross the Atlantic. Stuart's ship was still a dot on the horizon when Professor Morgan stepped out of the aft deck and stood beside Clement. Once again, Stuart had managed to entangle a man of talent into his mad quest. Morgan spread both hands upon the railing and squinted at the horizon. "Be safe, old friend," Clement thought as he pulled his eyes away from Stuart. "Lord Erskine's cabin has been readied. Perhaps his valet should see to it that if he has any other needs," Professor Morgan said with a dimpled grin at the ruse. Lord Erskine. Well, Morgan had the arrogance to play the part of a nobleman. Sergeant Carnes looked the part, and after 4 decades of servitude, he'd earned the role of a lifetime. Clement didn't mind taking order from Carnes. "It was a long night," Clement answered. "Lord Erskine needs his rest." Both teams departed under the cover of darkness, and in 3 small rowboats they'd snuck away via the Tay River before getting a small vessel to bring them up the coast from Perth to the larger port of Aberdeen. Stuart had sold his own private yacht to rent 2 ships out of Aberdeen. Each party had enough funds to improvise the rest of the mission. "I suppose we could all use some rest after that dramatic departure from Mirthly Castle. Do you really think the castle was being watched by spies from the Order of Eos?" Clement nodded. They'd paid a few of the locals to watch the comings and goings of the castle. So while they watched the front gates, we went out the back door. "McPherson told me that you traveled with Stuart to the Holy Lands." "I did," Clement admitted. It was 1839. Nicollet returned to the frontier with Geyer to meet with Chief Wahanaten, while Stuart and I went to visit ancient Israel. "Fascinating. What did you see?" "Dust and stone." Morgan laughed. "I suppose you would see a lot of dust and stone." "A lot of stuff about King Solomon." "Ah, of course. He's a pivotal figure in the Bible as well as Masonic lore." "Templar Knights. He talked a lot about them." "Of course. The Templar Knights fueled the Great Crusades. Their name comes from the Knights of the Temple of Solomon. Legend has it that the entire conflict was invented so they had an excuse to gain access to the old temple. The old Norse and Norman families had an itch to scratch, and after visiting the old ruins, they turned their attention westward. That's ironic. Stuart explored the West and then turned his attention to the Middle East. Life truly is a cycle. What else did you see during this tour?" "You'd have to ask Stuart about all those names and places. All I know is that it convinced him to listen to Nicollet. And here we are." "I'm sorry about what happened to your father." "He was an old man who didn't deserve to die like that." "And you're heading back to America to get revenge on the men who killed him?" "Yep." "Stuart tells me the Order of Eos is thriving in America." "Apparently, but some of them won't be thriving for much longer." "Ha, yes. You have a connection to the branch of the Sinclair family?" Clement shrugged. "I grew up with Sinclairs. It doesn't matter which Sinclair is responsible for the death of my father. I'll kill them all if I have to." "I hope you know that I'm not coming with you to help you kill anyone." "I'll handle the killing." If I do it right, I won't have to kill too many. My father taught me how to hunt elk. Do you know what an elk is? A large deer. They roam in great herds, like the Sinclairs. The chaos of the movement can almost be overwhelming. So, like the wolf, a sniper watches for one to step away from the pack. The one who runs alone becomes the target. It was the same thing for Mexicans during the war. Any Sinclair who steps away from the pack will be who I kill. Morgan scoffed. I think I understand. The history professor stood silent for several minutes, a smug grin on his face that had Clement asking, "If you can't kill, then why are you coming with us?" Professor Morgan took a moment to respond. Curiosity. I lost my position at the last two universities for spurious thinking, which is a way of saying I refuse to accept the orthodox view. I found historians are trained to research, but their publications must support the most widely accepted conclusions. Deviate from the norm and find yourself on the outside looking in. I don't follow. I was fired for disagreeing with historical facts. What the people believe is true. Excuse me? It's a Chippewa saying. But you are Cree, a northern neighbor of the Chippewa. In my childhood, I spent a lot of time trading with the Chippewa. That's why I went ahead of Nicollet to Fort Snelling. The Chippewa saying asks, what makes a fact a fact? History is often what is agreed upon, isn't it? Exactly my point. I dared to suggest that Christopher Columbus was not the first to discover North America, and for my sins I've been cast out by reputable universities. A few years ago, I visited Merthley Castle to see the library that once belonged to William Drummond of Longueuilmont. Stuart allowed it, and after I lost my position, he offered his patronage in researching his own family, and of course, the Order of Eos. So you're familiar with our enemy? Clement politely offered a chance for Morgan to show off. Oh yes, it is a mythos as rich as ancient Norse mythology, which is where I first discovered it. Eos, the illustrious men of the dawn. In Norse mythology, 4 sons survived the great cataclysm known as Ragnarok. The Order of Eos believes it is descended from a godly bloodline, and buried deep in the earth, their gods wait to return and restore their place. It's a blurred line between mythology and history. I know Stuart has become a religious man. Are you a religious man? Clement, chewing on the inside of his mouth for a moment, answered, I am a vile man, and whoever's version of the Creator is correct, I deserve his punishment. I think Stuart believes in redemption, which is why he sailed first to Rome. Nicollet had come and gone from his life like Halley's Comet, and now Stuart vanished from sight also. Without a word to Morgan, Clement returned to his cabin. Chapter 15. The Port of Inverness, 1852. The next day, the steamship Argyle made port in Inverness. When viewing the busy dock, Lewis Carnes saw danger in each and every face. The faster they left, the better the mission. After several quiet minutes alone, Professor Morgan and Antoine Clement joined him on the deck railing as the crewmen secured the lines. So much for being secretive and discreet. How long will we be docked? Professor Morgan asked. Just for a few hours, Carnes said. We have to leave Aberdeen so quickly that our captain didn't have enough fuel or supplies to get us to Bergen, which is where we'll be securing transportation across the Atlantic. Morgan repeated the plan. Exactly. Spontaneity was the key to our great escape from Merthley Castle. No one knew we were leaving. No one knew where we were going. If our enemies happened to figure out we left by ship, they'd have to do some amazing detective work to know which ship and its destination. Then why are you nervous? Morgan asked. We're still in Scotland, Carnes admitted. Anything is possible. It'd take days for a good investigator to find out we hopped on a small ship at Dundee and then separated at Aberdeen. But a lucky investigator could have figured things out faster. So none of us are stepping off the ship. Absolutely, Lord Erskine, Morgan answered. The professor seemed to be testing the boundaries of the relationship. While Stuart spoke highly of his loyalty and intelligence, Morgan also had a reputation for being arrogant. "We're still in Scotland," Cairns repeated. "I'm still Sergeant Carnes, you're still Professor Morgan, and he's still Stuart's Indian friend. The invented title is only to be used when we're in foreign countries." Carnes had known Clement longer than Morgan and glanced over to make sure he took no offense. Despite being a quiet man, Clement had a prickly nature and could easily be offended. From what Stuart had told him, Clement could kill a man without ever raising his voice. "Sergeant Carnes," Morgan repeated, "I've known you for a couple years now, and in all that time I never knew you were a military man. I knew you were in charge of estate security, but is that how you came into the service of Lord Stuart?" "We served together in the 15th King's Hussars during the Waterloo campaign, which is why I worry about being recognized by one of the soldiers that I served under. After the war, I went into security. For my part, I investigated the death of his aunt." "Ah, and that's when Joseph Nicollet entered the picture." "Yes," Carnes said, "but it's where we learned the name. Learned the name Nicollet, and how he'd been shown the map before Lady Drummond's death. That is when I learned all about the Order of Eos and those crazy prophecies and those cursed maps." "Yes, the maps. So the Abaran map was in the possession of Solomon Delhut, and the Almaric map was in the possession of Joel Ponset. And we allowed Delhut to live in exchange for information about Nicolet's murderer," Clement added. "Yes, the Delhuts and Sinclairs are both familiar names in Eos legends," Morgan said. "And by allowing Delhut to live, he hired assassins to hunt down the men who threatened his life and walked away with the ancient Eos map." "That's correct," Carnes said. He'd wanted to take in the view, but instead found himself yapping away with the curious professor. "You'll have to forgive me. A week ago I was reading in the Mirthly Library, and now here I am in Inverness, about to embark on a bizarre revenge tour. I'm just trying to understand my role in this venture." "I heard Lord Stuart explain it to you in front of the whole group." Yes. The ancient king and the ancient kingdom who created the Philosopher's Stone. I understand his theories, but what is my role in this expedition?" "You're our expert on the Order of Eos." "After I kill the men responsible," Clement added, "we'll return to find the stone. And that's where you'll need my expertise." "I'm sure it'll be quite an adventure. But if Clement is in charge of revenge and you're responsible for securing the relic, then it seems to me that I am in charge of fact-finding." What is he thinking? "Yes, that is a safe assumption. And spontaneity is key to this mission." "It is. We'll secure new passage in Bergen, and then the crew of the Argyle will have no idea where we went next. Likewise, Lord Stuart won't likely leave ship until he reaches Italy." "Yes, I'm the one who suggested Bergen to him. But if we're also on a fact-finding mission to understand the Order of Eos better, perhaps I could propose a modification to our mission." Cairns' glare was also joined by an icy stare from Clement. "If spontaneity is as important as my research into Eos, then let's stop by the Orkney Isles on our way to Bergen." "If you give a good reason," Cairns insisted. "The Sinclair family comes from the Orkney Island. If we are about to hunt Canadian Sinclairs, it might help us to learn a bit more about our enemy." "It's on the way," Carnes clarified. Professor Morgan nodded. "He wants to kill Sinclairs. I want to learn more about the Order of Eos." "How long will you need?" "A day or two at the most. A walk through a few cemeteries should be enough." Cairns nodded. "Once the ship is resupplied, I'll update the captain about our new destination. It shouldn't hurt to make port for a day." Chapter 16, The Orkney Islands, 1852. Corey Morgan checked his watch, then his satchel, and then his wooden box, which had a few sandwiches prepared by the Argyll's cook. Lord Erskine and his valet, Cairns and Clement, stood upon the top deck as the crew secured the private vessel in a small north-facing harbor. He looked up to Lord Erskine and gave a friendly wave of appreciation for his fact-finding mission. It was true that nobody outside the family and a few scholars from Edinburgh could recognize him, but even so, a cabin boy named Harry stood at his side to accompany him on the brief expedition. True to their reputation, the Orkney Islands were barren and drab with few trees in sight. If the islands were compared to a four-leaf clover, the port of Kirkwall was right in the middle of the four leaves. Unlike Aberdeen, only a few other steamships docked amongst the smaller fishing vessels. "Ready for an adventure, Harry?" Morgan asked. "It's better than cleaning Lord Erskine's cabin." The lie is already taking root. For his part, Corey Morgan played a novelist who was working on a narrative about the Vikings. Harry played the part of his son. Once on the docks, Morgan learned where he could hire a driver, and in 10 minutes, the three were in a simple wagon climbing the hill that led out of town. "How long will it take to get to the Ring of Brogdar?" "It's a good weather day," the driver added. "My girls will get you there in about an hour and a half." "Dad," Harry asked coyly, "what are the Rings of Brodgar?" "Well, they're often called the Stonehenge of the Orkneys. They are an ancient stone circle, and no one really knows who built them or when they were set up." "What do they do?" Harry asked. "They don't do anything. Many believe they might have been used for astronomical observations, while others think they were once used for human sacrifice." He turned to the driver. "Do you get many travelers wanting to see them?" "I reckon it's one of the most popular reasons for any traveler to get off that ship. I bring folks out to it quite often during the summer." There were several small sheep farms along the main road, and the terrain continued to be sprawling green fields dotted by the occasional rock outcropping. "You can see the Loch of Stennis at the bottom of the hill. It's a shame they don't have a bridge or causeway connecting it to the other side of the lake. We'll have to go all the way around the lake to reach the ring." "Have you lived on the Orkney Islands your whole life?" "Oh, yes. My father was Norwegian and has Scottish and Norwegian roots, but my mother's side comes from the ancient Picts." "I've been told that I have some Pictish blood as well." "What are the Picts, Dad?" "Well, they are the remnants of an Iron Age tribe that painted themselves. Unfortunately, my book is going to feature the Viking era. Say, you wouldn't happen to have any churches or cemeteries along the way?" "Well, there's a small church at Downby, which is where we turn to reach the west side of the lake. But there's a large cemetery near the Stony Hill Castle overlooking the lake. I've heard tell that some of those gravestones date back 1,000 years, mostly Sinclair's." "Sinclair's?" "I found a story that talked about Prince Henry Sinclair traveling to North America. I believe the folks who live in Stony Hill Castle are descendants of his. To my families, they are new blood. I think he came out of, I forget the name of the town. Caithness? No, Roslin. At the time, the Norwegians held the Orkney Islands and gave it to their Scottish ally." "If it's no trouble, I'd very much like to visit." There's another road that'll still head toward Downby. It'll just add 10 minutes to our trip." The ruse had worked. A few minutes later, Professor Morgan walked among the open fields overlooking the eastern shore of the inland lake. While the distant castle had a stone fence surrounding it, the cemetery had no such precautions, which allowed him access to the gravestones. The driver waited back at the road. Across the narrow channel, Morgan could see the monoliths of the Ring of Brodgar, which explained why the Sinclair castle faced it. The cemetery was closer to the water's edge, built along the gentle slope. "Sir, may I be excused to relieve myself?" Harry asked politely. "I'd feel wrong relieving myself on sacred ground." "Run along." The boy ran down the hill to a ravine filled with brush where he could get some privacy. Suddenly, horsemen came riding in hard from Stony Hill Castle. Even from a distance, he could see rifles drawn on the driver. Then two riders charged down the hill and galloped between the gravestones. State your business." My apologies. My name is Scott Caldhame. I'm a writer doing research into ancient Norse families." "So you say," one gunman said. "You're coming with us, and we'll get to the bottom of this." "I mean no offense. I was going to visit the Rings of Brodgar when my driver mentioned this old graveyard." "Those are our kin you're standing on." "We'll sort this out up at the house and find out the truth of the matter." Nothing else was said. The driver had dismounted the wagon and was being led by gunpoint to a barn outside the stone fence. By the time Morgan entered the barn, the driver was already telling them all about who he was and what his business was. The gunman seemed to accept his story easily, and then turned to Morgan. "And what's his story? Where'd you get him? What's he doing here?" The driver repeated the lie, which to him was the truth. "And what gives you the right to bring a stranger into our private cemetery?" Again, the driver repeated the whole scene, but ended with, "He was the one who asked about churches and cemeteries." "What's your interest in our family?" Then all eyes were upon Morgan. While he repeated the lie about being a writer, he remembered Harry. The boy obviously would have seen and heard the abduction, so the longer the story took, the better his chances were of getting back to the ship before the gunman learned about the sun. The trip had been about 8 miles, so if the boy ran as hard as he could be there in under half an hour if he kept off the road. So Morgan quickly shifted to his interest in the Ring of Brodgar. "Research," one of the gruff-looking men repeated. "I don't like the sound of that at all." "He's written down a dozen or more names in his notebook." A third man actually started to eat the food intended for lunch. "Tell us more about this book of yours." The question allowed Morgan to improvise for a time. He spoke honestly about his childhood obsession with Viking culture, and then broke into a tale about Vikings seeking a lost continent that would be America. The longer he spoke, the less afraid he became. All 4 men were rough and tumble, but seemed to be earnest men whose role involved protecting the Sinclair estate at Stony Hill Castle. "I know I should have gone up to the front door and explained myself. My driver simply followed my orders. I'll leave, go right back to the ship, and be out of your hair immediately." Then the gunman began to have private conversations. "You can go outside and wait," one said to the driver. "We know your name and know where you're from. If this fellow checks out, we'll send you both on your way. If not, we'll send you on your way." The men chuckled, and Morgan felt fear return. Once the driver left, a new question made him fear even more. "Tell us about the ship you came in on." "Oh no, what have I done?" Unlike the story about being a writer, this one fell apart quickly when he was pressed for more details, and showing nervousness was like the smell of blood to a hungry wolf pack. "This isn't adding up. Are you believing this? I'm not. Should I go fetch Mr. Mowat? I don't think it'd take long to get to the truth out of him. I'll get the rope." Despite his pleas, Morgan found himself being bound by the wrists and ankles and then stretched out like the Vitruvian Man between a couple of beams in the barn. "The problem we're having, Mr. Caldhame, is that our lord and lady received correspondence a few weeks ago calling for heightened security and caution in the days to come. Then suddenly, out of the blue, you show up poking around the cemetery claiming to be a writer. So we need to understand more about where you came from and how you got here. Morgan tried to calm himself, but as he could see the men preparing instruments of torture, which in a functioning barn were plentiful. In the middle of explaining his visits to other Norse settlements near Edinburgh, the barn door flew open. Shouldering his Manton hunting rifle, Clement found the furthest man in the room and shot him squarely in the chest. He tossed the rifle to the ground and quickly found his pistol strapped to his chest. Still advancing, he spotted the second furthest man and shot through the man's outstretched fingers to his lower neck. With a 12-inch Bowie knife, Clement charged like an enraged bull buffalo at the closest man, piercing his torso with repeated punches before racing after the final victim. The fourth man had begun to run, but Clement rotated the knife in his fingers and sent the heavy blade into the man's back, knocking him to the ground. Clement pounced and finished him off. Professor Morgan wet his trousers as the knife suddenly rose and grew closer to him. "Who else saw you?" Antoine asked. "Was it just these four?" "They held you for 2 hours. Did anybody else come or go?" Just the driver," Morgan answered. "You don't have to worry about him either. Did they take anything that you can identify?" Professor Morgan shook his head, and Clement cut him free. "Hurry. They likely heard the shots from the castle." Following Clement out the door, he saw that Harry had replaced the driver in the seat of the wagon. Chapter 17. Allen's Have, 1852. Antoine Clement ignored the approaching coastline. Instead, he turned away. He walked to the stern of the private yacht and spent a few minutes staring into the gray of the Baltic Sea. When Professor Morgan joined him, Antoine put both hands upon the railing so as not to strangle the man to death. Fortunately, the idiot kept his mouth shut for several minutes, the best sort of apology he could hope for, given the situation. "He's likely stolen my chance at revenge." Over the past 1,100 miles, Clement refused to speak to the man and chose instead to sharpen his big skinning knife at the bow of the boat. For the past several days, Professor Morgan wisely kept his distance. But now, with land appearing on both sides of the yacht, the professor braved proximity, even with the big knife strapped to Antoine's belt. "Remind me again why we are traveling east instead of west?" The professor exhaled, his breath shaken either by fear or the cold. 16 miles is all that separates Sweden and Finland. That island ahead of us is Allen's Have, the channel marking the separation from the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Bothnia. With the element of surprise lost, we're embracing spontaneity and changing our destination. But only a short delay. He thinks I'm just a dumb brute. Yes, I agreed with Carnes about the plan. Remind me again why we are approaching Sweden. I figured before returning to Bergen, we'd take a slight detour to explore an old legend involving Sweden. It matters in the grand scheme of things. Antoine noticed a bit of dark crust lodged in his cuticles. Dried blood. Perhaps Stuart was wrong about redemption. A tiger can't change his stripes. Since he was a boy, Antoine had a talent, killing things. As a hunter, he had no rivals, beginning with rabbits and squirrels and later with bison and elk. His ability to stalk his prey was topped only by his marksmanship. From his childhood at Hudson Bay to his adult years on the plains and in the Rockies, his skill at doling out death was done well. For that reason, Lord William Drummond Stuart hired him as a guide. If Antoine had no peer in North America, Stuart had few rivals as a European hunter. As soldier and hunter, Stuart's reputation preceded him, and their competitive rivalry turned into something unexpected. Antoine dedicated himself to Lord Stuart, and for a few years their competitive relationship thrived, until Nicolette. Although Nicolette wanted nothing to do with a physical, intimate relationship, Stuart nevertheless fell madly in love with the little French scientist. At first, religion became a roadblock to the relationship, but Stuart accepted the challenge, getting baptized in St. Louis with Nicolet as his sponsor. Later, Stuart and Clement went on a trip to the Holy Lands to investigate Nicolet's theories on the origins of the Philosopher's Stone. But even alone with Stuart on the far side of the world, the burning fascination Stuart had once shown him had turned to other obsessions. Am I doomed to be a killer and to die alone? Antoine flicked the dried blood from his cuticle. Even after 1,100 miles of nautical travel, Clement still felt as if they were being followed. Carnes paid the captain and crew handsomely for the detour, especially after Harry returned to the ship wide-eyed. If anything of the murders was connected to them, heading directly to Bergen could have been a mistake. Professor Morgan was right. No one would expect them to go to Sweden. What's in Sweden? Professor Morgan swallowed hard, a sign of nervousness. Somewhere on the Mediterranean, our friends are meeting with an ancient organization known as the Periphery. I like the thought of a secret society guiding and watching over God's chosen people, but that also means that the Order of Eos is equally real. My focus is learning about our enemy. I know you want vengeance for the wrongs done to you, but I'm here to support that. But Lord Stuart also tasked me with researching our enemy. My enemy waits for my blade in Canada, Clement insisted. Morgan cleared his throat to boldly answer. Your blade only cuts the grains from a single stalk of wheat, but the roots of your enemy go deep into the earth. We're in Sweden to understand the origins of our enemy. Have you seen the portrait, haven't you? The portrait. Even dead, Nicolet continued to keep the attention of Lord Stuart. Even after finding vengeance, the portrait of Nicolet haunted Lord Stuart, sending him into a new manic frenzy. The island of Atlantis? Is that it beside us? Did we come to Sweden to find the lost continent? Clement mocked. Morgan withheld any reaction, clearly still afraid. The mythology of Atlantis, including the tales of Hyperborea and Thule, describes survivors of the Great Cataclysm, a tall, light-skinned race whose blood was mixed with the gods searched for a new home. Many of the tales say the survivors went far to the east, searching for a sacred mountain that brought the world into creation. Other tales say the survivors settled in the north. Ah, Sweden. There are many tribes and nations in the north, mind you, so it is like searching for a needle in a haystack. But when a family becomes a nation and later becomes an empire, that family is worthy of study. The Sinclair family? Antoine asked bitterly, thinking of the terrible event that transpired days earlier. I kicked the hornet's nest. The pall of the event hung over them and still stuck in his cuticles. No, Professor Morgan answered. The Sinclair family only gained prominence in the past few centuries. The family we are seeking gave birth to the Goths. Most historians believe the Goths began with King Berig, who came across the Baltic Sea to settle and conquer Germany. But my theory is that following the destruction of their island home, the fair-skinned survivors settled Sweden, possibly as early as 2000 BC, where they kept themselves for centuries. Their stories became the origins of what we know as Norse mythology. Tucked away for centuries in the north, they held on to their old religion for generations until foreigners came knocking on their door. Like us. The Romans? Likely. The Goths emerged around that time. With their isolation at an end, the Goths suddenly became active with an interest that drove them to wage war with Rome. Do you know where the Goth invaders finally settled? Clement felt his jaw tighten. Just tell me. He didn't want to play games with Morgan. He shook his head slightly. The Goths ended up destroying the Roman Empire before settling in the Transylvania region in what is now known as the country of Wallachia and How could he just rattle off facts after what happened? I've given thought to cutting out your tongue and feeding it to the dogs, Clement interrupted. I don't know how else to apologize, Professor Morgan said between staggered breaths. You dare speak to me about wheat and roots and the history of our enemy after pulling a stunt like you did back in Orkney? Morgan shifted his weight away from Clement. Now, standing at the back railing of the yacht, Clement flicked away the last bit of blood shed in Orkney. We're at war with the Order of Eos, especially the Sinclair family. You and I are both soldiers for Lord Stuart, but I outrank you in all matters. Your curiosity almost ruined our mission. I'm returning to America for vengeance, and if those men back in Orkney had found out who you were and why you were there, which they would have, the rats would have run back down into the cellar. I'm going to cut someone's heart out and eat it while it still beats for killing my father. Anything Stuart wants from you is secondary. Is that understood? Professor Morgan nodded. He's a fool, but not a coward. Come with me. There's something I need to give you, Antoine said, leading back to the cabins of the Argyle. Each cabin was modest except for the false lord's cabin, and Clement's floor had a chest large enough to be a coffin. He unlocked it and flipped open the lid. Inside, he had a small arsenal of weapons, ranging from rifles and pistols to knives and bayonets. Once, he allowed Stuart's affection to clothe him, but in recent years, all of Stuart's affections turned into the finest weapons that could be acquired. Take it. Antoine handed Morgan a Colt Patterson revolver and sheathed knife he required in the Mexican War. These served me well. Morgan acted as if Clement had handed him a human spleen. 2 shots per man, Clement insisted. It can kill 3 men if the trigger doesn't get stuck. And tuck this knife in your boot if there's more than 3 men. Morgan wheezed. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. We're at war. But before you say or do anything during our stop in Sweden, I want you to explain it to me first. From now on, you advise, and I'll act. Understood? Morgan nodded. Say it. I'll advise, and you'll act. Good. Now, tell me more about what we're going to find in Sweden. Chapter 18. Fors, Sweden, 1852. Vaktar Forsberg bridled his team of North Swedish horses to the wagon and petted their muscular flanks as he passed. Unlike his normal routine of bringing a wagon full of milk canisters into town, today the wagon held a treasure. Leif Forsberg, his father, stood with hands on hips as Vaktar finished preparing the wagon for the trip. While milking cows allowed the family to trade for other goods in the village on a daily basis, the other Forsberg trade was woodworking, and after a long winter, Leif and his 3 sons produced another masterpiece. Leif tucked the canvas tarp around it and violently shoved and pushed to make sure his sons had indeed secured the load. You're a man now. I expect you to succeed all on your own. Vaktar nodded. Is this the final test for me? Grinning their well wishes, his younger brothers gathered beside their father. Vaktar had been there when each of the horses came into the world as greasy foals, and now his future depended on their maturity as well. Aska, Blixt, let's go. The horses listened despite not being commanded by Leif, and the rig began its descent down to the river. The Forsberg family lived on a wooded hill between the villages of Fors, Lund, and Avesta. At the bottom of the hill, the pines had been cleared centuries ago for grazing pastures, but the slopes of the hill still remain untouched old forest. Any tree upon the property was cherished for its workmanship, making each as valuable as the prized horses or dairy cows. A man with an axe or saw, Leif had taught his sons, should be shot on sight. Vaktar never had to kill a pine poacher, but he did have to shoulder his rifle to warn trespassers. Today, Vaktar descended the hill to Avesta. On the southwestern corner of the property, he passed the origin of the family's namesake, the waterfalls. The land wasn't mountainous by any stretch, but the large hill, with a circumference of 3 miles, collected enough snowfall to send rapids to the rivers, which cut through the sediment at the base of the hill to create a deep gorge. The most treacherous part of the journey into Avesta was passing over the Pine Bridge. Hitting it crooked meant shifting the weight of the wagon and tipping his cargo into the flooded gorge. He slowed the horses on approach just to square the wagon, and then lashed to increase the speed so that the wagon bounced instead of catching over the first beam. With enough speed, the wheels kept spinning, and he was safely on the other side. The town of Avesta was 3 miles from the gorge, built upon the Dalavan River, which began deep in the center of Sweden and ended at the Gulf of Bothnia. It once had been a thriving forge, providing the area with copper and iron. Now, for Vaktar, it provided a far more valuable resource, a possible bride. The trip to town alone meant not only earning his father's trust as a man, but also that the 16-year-old boy could also search for a bride. If he couldn't find one in Avesta, he'd have to search elsewhere in the world. The world is full of beautiful women. Unfortunately, Vaktar lost his front teeth in a fist fight with some local boys from the village of Lund, rendering him unwilling to smile. He did twice the work as his brothers, knowing that his freckled face and red hair and missing teeth could be overlooked if he was as strong as an ox. At just 16, he boasted the barrel chest and broad shoulders of a 40-year-old man rather than a teenager. No girls lined the streets of the town, so he kept his eyes on the road and led the team to the far northwestern side of town, where the road met the bridge. Just before the bridge, he turned, taking a narrow street down to a factory parking lot. There, the mayor of Avesta waited with a crew of several men, including a dark-skinned giant from a foreign land. Vaktar and his 3 brothers had managed to load the wagon themselves, but the mayor had almost 10 men waiting. It made Vaktar slightly nervous. He'd beaten those boys from Lund despite being outnumbered, but these were adult men who waited for him. So Vaktar set the brakes on the wagon. As Vaktar set the brakes on the wagon, the group separated into 2 small groups, with the mayor and his sons taking a few steps away from the others. "Ah, Forsberg, the prize has arrived." Vaktar climbed off the seat of the wagon and began untying the canopy tarp. The mayor's sons helped, and soon Vaktar was able to pull the tarp free, revealing the treasure. "Lord Erskine, come see, this should interest you." The fat lord, with his bushy white goatee and layered clothing, came waddling over to the wagon. The dark-skinned foreigner and a black-bearded man followed. In the distance, 2 men stood at the pier watching the proceedings. Vaktar began undoing the heavy straps while the mayor gloated about his purchase. "Speaking of living history, let me show you my beautiful new bearding." "Is this a Viking longboat?" the bearded man asked, translating. The locals laughed. "Viking? In a way, I suppose. We're river rats around here. Centuries ago, our craftsmen designed a boat that could not only be taken over rocks and rapids of our Swedish rivers, but could also cut through the big waves of the open seas. The Forsberg family is famous for their craftsmanship. Even though the days of the Goth and Viking are now ancient history, they still make a longship every 3 years. I happened to be the highest bidder for this beauty. It's only ceremonial, but it's still beautiful, isn't it?" Lord Erskine said something in English, which Vaktar didn't understand well. The young translator with the black beard, however, spoke Swedish with a peculiar accent. "It looks very authentic." "This isn't a replica," the mayor continued. "The Forsbergs have been making boats throughout recorded history. Before Avesta had a copper forge, We were famous for making these ships. They're virtually indestructible. If you've sincerely investigating Viking history, as you put it, you should begin and end with the Forsberg family. Suddenly, all eyes were on Vaktar, who wished to be back home. Our journey is to find the Knoyen family, the translator explained. Lord Erskine's relatives are descendants of this fellow named Knoyen. He looked down to his notebook, correcting him by stating, Knoyen of Dalavan. The mayor and his sons began talking to each other. We find it strange that anyone would claim to belong to the river rather than a town. There are not any families by the name Knoyen. The name sounds Dutch. The Lord and his men talked. As they conferred, they kept referencing a book, but Vaktar studied the dark-skinned man, who was unlike any man he'd ever seen. From the details of his face, skin, and hair, Vaktar made an assumption. He's a native from America. Finally, the bearded translator had a response. Yes, you are correct. The fellow we seek was a Dutch priest by the name of Jacob Knoyen. After visiting with King Magnus, this astronomer priest returned with men of his expedition to their home in Dalavan. My apologies for the misreading. I know this story, the mayor declared when he put his hand on Vaktar's shoulder. The lost men who found a northern passage. 20 years gone, only to return as weathered old men. The men of the expedition were certainly Swedes. The translator put his finger in the book, then nodded. Yes, it does say Goths and Northmen were on the journey. How do you know this? Lee Forsberg told me this story while sitting at his great stone chimney, the mayor bragged. Our greatest export, beyond copper and ships, is the Forsberg men. They are all great explorers. They travel out into the world and rarely come back. But when they do come back, they return with tales, and occasionally priests. Vaktar shifted uncomfortably. Are you saying this boy can attest to the tale written in the book? I'm only saying I've heard the story before, the mayor added. I'm not even sure if Vaktar knows this story. Vaktar knew the story. Neighbors would schedule seasonal visits with his storytelling father, bringing their children for hours of stories. As a result, Vaktar had heard countless stories of countless Forsbergs and their travels to distant lands. I know it. Everyone grew smiles. What are the odds, Lord Erskine? The mayor posed. I told you my village had a rich history. You should stay for a few more days, and we can tell you more. Lord Erskine nodded, then had a private conversation with his traveling companions. The bearded translator kept eyeing Vaktar, which made him a bit uncomfortable. Finally, the translator asked him directly, We'd love to speak directly with your father about his storytelling. Vaktar looked to the mayor for help, but clearly he was concerned with only bringing his prize vessel to his house, a trophy of his wealth. It's a few miles north of here. The men conferred before the translator spoke. We'll leave some of our men here with our little steamship, but we'd very much like to travel back to your father and speak with him. Shit. Vaktar thought the hardest part of his day was going to be delivering the longship to town. It was a test of manhood to steer the wagon along the safest path to town, but now his manhood was being tested by his judgment. So are these men friends or foes? Chapter 19, Runefield, 1852. A bunch of bloody pagans, Carnes thought as they toured the rocky hill above the farmhouse. There is probably a shallow grave waiting for the three of us. Trailing behind them, Antoine Clement walked beside the Forsberg boy. Professor Morgan passed information between his host and himself. Leif Forsberg was a true Viking, and Carnes wondered if a skilled killer like Clement could contend with the brute. Meanwhile, Carnes felt like a transparent fraud. The entire Forsberg family eyed him suspiciously, as if suspecting that under his fancy clothes he was a fat soldier named Louis Carnes. It was easier being Sergeant Carnes, who took orders and kept to himself, than it was playing the part of a Scottish lord seeking to understand his family heritage. If this family turns out to be the Order of Eos, will Clement kill them all? It was looking more likely by the minute. After an evening of warm hospitality, where Mrs. Forsberg tried to stuff as much food into them as humanly possible, Leif Forsberg woke them the next morning with the promise of a wondrous tour. "These are rune stones," Morgan finally declared like a child at Christmas, taking a moment to explain to him. "They chronicle important events, like a book written upon stone." Why do they give me the chills? "What are we doing out here, Morgan?" "Patience. I owe Stuart my findings, and I'll give it to him when we return." "You'd better not be putting us in danger again." "Danger? From overfeeding? These are just simple farmers." Yet seeing the rune stones and their blood-red lettering, Carnes wasn't so sure. Leif Forsberg finally stopped talking, patting the top of the stone. Morgan explained. The Forsberg family had a tradition that went back over 1,000 years. The eldest Forsberg son did not inherit, as most cultures followed, but instead they were sent out into the world as explorers. Viking was not a nationality, but instead a verb to adventure. The woodworking skill passed down from father to son ended up with a firstborn Forsberg son in possession of a longboat that could take a dozen of his friends out into the world. Initially, the river rats in the family would take their longships up and down the Dalavan River for the summer. Then it became a competition to see how far one could get and make it back before the river iced up. The fun adventure eventually became ingrained, fueling what would first become the Goth invasion of the European continent, and later the infamous Viking raiders of later centuries. If a firstborn son returned from his adventures, a runestone would be made to chronicle the journey, Morgan explained. Most times, the firstborn son was never seen again, and tales would be told around the fireplace of imagined heroism. Every once in a while, a son would come back. Carnes listened earnestly, even if the details were being absorbed by Morgan. Leif Forsberg stopped in front of one of the stones, which rose from the ground to meet his chest. He put a hand on it as if it were a prize cow. "We know what the history books say about Christopher Columbus, but this stone tells another narrative. You're not the first Scottish lord to come up the Dalavan River looking for hardy sailors." They are connected to Eos, Carnes decided, suddenly worrying about a trap. What has Morgan done? Leif seemed to sense he'd made a misstep. "Forsbergs are simple men, but in our hearts we yearn for adventure, especially adventure on the open sea. When an opportunity comes, it matters not who asks. We send." Professor Morgan finished translating and then knelt down to inspect the stone. "Most scholars believe that Noyan account is a myth. This stone is archaeological proof." "What does it prove?" Carnes asked. In 1349, King Magnus sent a rescue expedition to colonies west of Greenland. But west of Greenland is Canada. Exactly. Empires have been trying to make legal claims to North America in recent years, but combined with the written records and this runestone, it would appear as if King Magnus beat Columbus by 150 years. If only Stuart were here to witness all of this. I can only trust that Morgan is taking good notes. Leif Forsberg shifted to point out a few features of the stone. By the time this stone was carved, Forsbergs were Christian, but that matters not to some of the families who worship the old gods. Our reputation as skilled sailors and long boat craftsmen was as strong then as it is now. And another Scottish lord came looking for men to travel distant rivers in the west. I don't see the name of a Scottish lord. No, this runestone is meant to honor our Forsberg ancestor, not the man who hired him. The man who hired him was the Lord of the Orkney Isles. Sinclair. Damn it all, this is another bloody ambush. He looked at Clement, who was already tense and ready for anything. Morgan would be no use and was caught up in the moment. Arn Forsberg left in 1342, no older than my son is today. He crossed the Atlantic, following the path from the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. But from there, he pressed westward until he found the continent we now call America. He helped establish a colony there, and then returned to Greenland to let others know what they had found. After visiting the Greenland colony, Arn returned across the Atlantic until he reached the shores of Norway. But he was delayed when the Black Death reached Bergen. 5 years passed before he could return. You're speaking of the Knudsen expedition? Morgan added. There are church records from the Archdiocese of Nidaros in Bergen that claimed the Christian colonists in Greenland were enslaved and sent westward. It's the reason we originally were going directly to Bergen. Morgan found another piece of an old puzzle. The rumors were true. The Scottish lord grew impatient and swept up from his southern colony into Greenland, taking the Christian colonists prisoner, forcing them to man the ships that he took into the unknown. Bishop Bardson was tasked with finding the survivors, so he turned to my ancestor, Arn, to lead the rescue mission. 22 years after young Arn floated down the Dalavan River, he returned from the New World with a friend, Father Noyen, the Dutch astronomer. That is quite a tale, Carnes admitted once Morgan finished translating Leif's response. Oh, this hill is filled with such tales. We could spend several winters telling such stories. For the next 2 hours, Leif bragged about his family heritage through Professor Morgan, with Carnes feigning curiosity as the Scottish Lord Erskine. Since investigating the death of Lady Drummond decades earlier, Carnes understood the present-day web of secret societies that wrapped up his friend Stuart, but he never understood their history. It chilled him to be facing such an enemy as the Order of Eos, even if Antoine Clement showed no reaction at all. He wanted confirmation, though. So, on the second expedition to America, Arn Forsberg was pitted against the Scottish lord who'd originally hired him, Carnes stated. This family isn't part of Eos. It was used and left for dead by Eos. As I said, my family does not care for politics or religion as much as we crave adventure. A firstborn son has a duty to explore, while the second son has a duty to learn the history and the trade of the Forsberg legacy. So you are a second son? I am. My older brother Dagmar left home 20 years ago, and we have no idea if he is alive or dead. It was his intention to travel west, but instead of a longship, he took a steamship to America. So your son Vaktar, is it his destiny to leave home also? Now that he is a man, yes. If he is ready this summer, he could take a horse, a pair of oxen, and go find his way in the world. What if he was to come with us? Morgan asked. Excuse me, Carnes snapped to Morgan. We're not just adopting a child. He's stronger than me, Morgan remarked. And you've heard the family story. It's in their blood. He's 16. And then Morgan explained more to the Forsbergs. I'm a man, Vaktar insisted. It'd be my honor. You don't even know where we're going, Carnes argued. I've seen too many wild-eyed boys die in my life, and I'm not going to be responsible for any more. Where are you going? Leif Forsberg asked. Morgan found validation for the old Noyen legend in the runes, so Carnes first looked to Morgan, and then to Clement. What do you think? Clement cleared his throat. 2 astronomers? 2 Forsbergs? 2 Sinclairs? My French friend would call this divine providence. He looked for signs and omens to guide him. I didn't understand why we needed to come to this place, but now I understand. I think this boy could be an asset. Having been a young man from a poor family, Karn's only choice had been to join the military. He'd seen too many fathers cast away their sons to war, and an adventure to America was a much easier pill to swallow. Karn's turned back to the father. It is our intention to research this story about the Noyen account, which means we'll travel to Bergen, Norway, and then to the Faroe Islands before searching for this lost colony in America. Blood has already been shed since we began, and it will most certainly be shed again. Morgan explained this to Leif Forsberg, who then turned to his son. When the boy smiled a toothless grin, Karns knew Vaktar was coming. Karns could stomach men dying in war, but he dreaded putting the young man in harm's way, and danger waited for them in America. Chapter 20, Bergen, Norway, 1852. Professor Corey Morgan felt the hairs stand on the back of his neck, so he paused at the edge of an alleyway. I'm being followed. The city of Bergen, Norway was built in the heart of fjord country, which meant the hills were steep and the port was deep. A network of channels protected the city and harbor from the open waters of the Atlantic, which is what made it the heart of Viking history. Centuries after the raiders last sailed, Bergen still functioned as a major seaport, yet the atmosphere remained warm and inviting. Brightly colored three-story homes, yellow and red mostly, stacked along the steep face of the fjord, making countless neighborhoods visible from the water's edge. If I mess up again, the half-breed will kill me. Images of blood spurting from the Orkney men had filled his nightmares in the past few weeks, but the horrible wounds did not terrify him as much as the cold eyes of the man who took 5 lives without hesitation. Morgan killed those men with his recklessness, yet now he endangered the mission once again. The odds are in our favor, he'd insisted to the others when they had arrived in Bergen. Even if they knew we were departing from Bergen, they would have looked for us weeks ago. Either way, we have the element of surprise. Neither Karns nor Clement mustered an argument against his proposal to do a little researching before departing for America. Even if by some preposterous omniscient insight their identities had been discerned, the next step could not be guessed, nor could a port be guessed. 1,000,000 to 1 odds, Morgan told himself. Don't be such a coward. Morgan kept walking, but remained vigilant. If he hollered, he wondered if Clement and Erskine would hear him back at the port, only a few blocks away. He felt his nose running into his mustache, so he wiped it with his sleeve, and while he gathered his senses, he cleaned his wire-rimmed glasses with his other sleeve. His satchel was strapped over his head and neck to avoid pickpockets, and his hand found its way into his jacket, where he held the hilt of the short knife. With his right hand, he could clutch the satchel, and with his left, he could punch the knife into any possible thief. Strangely, the streets of Bergen hid any criminal element from sight, and with a deep breath, Morgan continued walking. Maria Kirken, one of the oldest structures in the port city, guided him with its 2 towers of gray and white until he finally stood in front of the fenced yard. Originally, there had been 12 churches built during the reign of King Olaf the Peaceful, who ruled Norway when St. Mary's Church was dedicated in 1070. Wars, fires, and plagues changed the city of Bergen since those days, but the beautiful church had been built to stand the test of time. Morgan boldly walked up to the front door and found it locked. So much for that idea. Morgan looked back to see if anyone on the streets took note. They didn't. The few who were shopping or in the market continued as they were. So he walked around to the side of the church where big wooden doors with ornate iron hinges, appeared to ward away any unwanted visitors. Surprisingly, the side doors were unlocked. "Hello," he called out. As a scholar in Old Norse language and literature, he'd studied all the Scandinavian languages in order to help with his translation of the old tales. So in Norwegian, he asked, "Is anyone here?" "Yes, hello," a man's voice pleasantly called out. A moment later, he stood toe to toe with the local Lutheran pastor, who introduced himself as Reverend Niles Krogstad. For everyone's sake, Morgan introduced himself as Professor Coldham, after his childhood home in the hills north of Edinburgh. Unlike Lord Stuart, he'd grown up poor, but as a scholar in the modern world, he knew education was his path away from tending sheep. "I'm attempting a family genealogy, and from what my mother told me, her great-grandmother came from Bergen. Do you happen to have baptismal records of your parishioners tucked away somewhere?" Reverend Krogstad did, and brought him into the basement of the Stark Church, where stone, wood, and a bit of stained glass reflected the cold northern climates. "While I can show you these records, I can't help you navigate them. I'm working on writing the sermon for Sunday. If you come back tomorrow, the fellow who organizes our records could help you. I only officiate." "I can tell this fellow is an orderly person just from the way these shelves are organized. Having been to several churches between here and Scotland, I can tell you that his system is very impressive." "Which is why you should come back tomorrow." "Oh, I can assure you that I wouldn't leave a stitch out of order. I have too much respect for the work he has done. I've done this a few times in other churches. I'll fetch you when I'm finished, and I can show you how I left things exactly as I found them." "It seems like a reasonable compromise," Reverend Krogstad admitted. "I'll be down to check on you shortly." With that, Professor Morgan began a trip back through time. 500 years earlier, Maria Kirken stood above Bergen's port, overlooking the comings and goings of commerce. Much of Europe was the same then as it was now. England, France, Russia, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden held similar borders, while countries like Germany, Castile, and Naples remained independent. Scotland, having won its independence, also stood alone. 3 centuries after the classic Viking era ended, King Magnus ruled both Norway and Sweden as regent for young King Hakon. Bishop Ivar Bardsson replaced Bishop Arni in 1347 as the leader of the Archdiocese of Nidaros, which covered the territories of Oslo, Bergen, Stavanger, Hamar, Orkney, and Iceland. Bishop Bardsson should have governed over only the spiritual concerns of his territory, but after a few short years, the Black Death crept over Europe and forced him into a different kind of leadership role. Morgan had already researched the era of the Black Death. In a span of 8 years, almost 200 million Europeans died from bubonic plague. For Bergen, it arrived in 1349. In the middle of this chaos, a cry for help was sounded on the edges of the known world. A Christian colony in Greenland reported raiders stealing away half of their population for a westward expedition. The Order of Eos. Professor Morgan knew the ancient enemy better than Antoine Clement did, which is why Stuart wanted him to be part of the Clement's revenge tour. At the time of the Black Death, Scotland was an independent nation. It had not been easy for Scotland. Under the leadership of Robert the Bruce, Scotland found itself at war with England. For his part, Bruce was excommunicated from the Catholic Church for murdering his rival in the Chapel of Greyfriars. When the warrant came for the arrest of all the Knights of Templar on Friday the 13th, 1307, Scotland turned a blind eye. While Grand Master Jacques de Molay burned at the stake and the infamous Templar fleet vanished from La Rochelle, surviving Templars found Scotland a place of sanctuary. The price for sanctuary? Fighting in its civil war. Aided by the influx of former Templar knights, Robert the Bruce won Scottish independence at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. In Orkney, the Sinclair family rose to power during this time, but Morgan found no mention of the Scots in the church records, which made sense. Yet he had pictured a covert mission to colonize America, and unable to build upon early success because of the Black Death in Europe, the leaders of the Sinclair colony had to find workers elsewhere. From what Morgan had gleaned from his previous research, the Sinclair colonists raided Greenland around 1342. The Greenland surviving colonists needed help from Bishop Bardson. The hero of the rescue operation, was a local Bergen man. Paul Knutsen was a lawman from nearby Hordaland. He was sent by King Magnus to deal with the issue in Greenland. Sent to crush the Order of Eos, Morgan realized. Now Clement plays the part of Knutsen. Greenland had a secret history. Following the Little Ice Age that began in the 1600s, Greenland remained almost uninhabitable, yet from the final years of the Viking era to the Black Death era, Greenland lived up to its name and became a fertile colony on the edge of the known world. After discovering the Book of Icelanders and the saga of Eric the Red, Morgan attempted to build upon his reputation as a Norse expert by writing about the era. He quickly lost his funding, his job, and his reputation. The world did not want to hear about a Sinclair expedition to America a century before Columbus. As much as he wanted to attribute jealousy or ignorance, he suspected that William Drummond Stewart later confirmed the Order of Eos wanted to control the narrative. Unlike his surprising discovery in Sweden, Maria Kirken had no records of Knutsen's death or any accounts if he ever returned. With civilization reeling from the Black Death, it seems the world forgot all about the conflict happening across the Atlantic. But no mention of the Danish astronomer Jacob Noyen. Even so, this confirms part of the Noyen account as well as the tale of Arne Forsberg. Morgan finished his notes, packed up, and walked up to where Reverend Krogstad was huddled over his sermon notes. "Thank you for your time. Good day." "Did you find your ancestors?" Yes, I thank you for your time." He found a spring in his step as he walked back down the hill. Soon they would cross the Atlantic for North America, which would allow him to visit the place where Knutsen once traveled. Hold on. His footsteps had an echo, and when he paused, he heard 2 steps followed by a hurried scramble. He turned but saw nothing. The specter of Eos loomed over everything. His first priority remained his satchel. Defending his life came second. The docks were 5 blocks away, so as long as the satchel wasn't ripped from his possession, he figured he could cause enough ruckus to get the attention of others. Even so, he found the hilt of the knife Clement had given him. This time, instead of stopping or turning, he let his eyes scan for danger. In the reflection of store windows, he saw the figure following him. He thought about running, but by the time he weighed the decision, he heard the figure jogging towards him. His fingers readied themselves on the hilt. He felt a strong hand on his shoulder, which held the satchel. He slipped the knife out from his pocket, but had to cross his body while spinning to do anything with it. A strong arm crashed down on his left forearm, sending the blade clattering to the ground. As he turned to face his attacker, Morgan stepped backward and tripped on his own feet, falling onto his backside with enough force that his head recoiled also. The attacker muttered in Swedish. Morgan knew the voice and meaning. "You're not the sharpest knife in the drawer." White fangs and a pink tongue grinned back at him, and Vaktar Forsberg extended a hand. Morgan adjusted his askew glasses and accepted the hand. "Apparently I'm not. I thought you were a robber. Lord Erskine wanted me to follow you. I've been watching you since you stepped off the docks." "You followed me to the church?" "I went down into the basement to watch you read." He wanted to test how much of a sneak I could be. How did I do? "Well enough," Morgan admitted, but withheld any more praise due to his wounded pride. "He also sent me to protect you, and now I understand why you need protection," the Swede teased. Finally comfortable, Morgan walked with Forsberg the last blocks to find Clement and Carnes waiting. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Carnes asked. "I almost stabbed the boy," Morgan protested Clement and Carnes. When Vaktar quietly shook his head in disagreement, the others laughed. I found reinforcement, but not the evidence I'd hoped for, Morgan answered about his investigation into the Noyan account. What about you? The USS Volga is returning to America tomorrow morning, Carnes said. On the way, we'll be stopping at the Faroe Islands to pick up a load of salmon bound for Boston. Any thoughts on Boston? Not Montreal? He asked, assuming they'd set out from the frontier via the Great Lakes. Then he remembered his occult history and smiled. Boston will do nicely. Chapter 21. The Faroe Islands, 1852. 300 miles off the coast of Norway, the Faroe Islands serve as a midpoint between Europe and Iceland. With rugged terrain, few if any trees, and a tundra climate, the 18 islands that formed the island of Sheep were an important territory during the Viking era. But in recent years, the islands had become part of the Danish kingdom, despite the fact that Scotland was only 200 miles south. Clement noted that, like Bergen's homes, the houses of Teganes were brightly painted to contrast with the stark environment. Without trees, the steep roofs were green to give the settlement a warm, friendly atmosphere for approaching ships. Nordic enough for you? Antoine Clement asked Professor Morgan. The professor seemed to have found his backbone again and now dared to look Clement in the eyes when speaking. Yes, I'm curious to learn a bit more about Faroese history during our stop. The study of culture and heritage is just so fascinating. Heritage. Clement nodded. He'd learned several cultures in the past 2 decades, and after his father's murder, the word meant much more to him now. Back in 1831, Antoine Clement wintered in the Black Hills in Lakota Territory. His skills as a hunter and marksman were known on the plains, and the local Blackfoot Lakota invited him to spend the winter with them to hunt deer, elk, and bison. Isolated by the prairie to the east and the Rocky Mountains to the west, the Blackfoot Lakota had only a few encounters with the white men, whom Clement warned them about. During the winter, the Blackfoot elders gave him a young bride, and by spring he fathered a daughter named Little Star. When the snows melted, Clement, promising to return in the fall with goods and wealth, left his family behind. Instead, he found alcohol and lost everything. From newspapers purchased in Bergen, Clement learned that the Wild West had all been but tamed. Both Wisconsin and Minnesota territories were open for settlement, and colonies of Scandinavians were taking advantage of geography similar to their homes. The USS Volga stuffed its hold with Scandinavian staples and cabins full of immigrants bound for Boston. Unlike the desperate Irish, the Scandinavians left for improved opportunity and economic standing with plans of purchasing farms and homesteads in the Great Lakes region. When Clement left Minnesota in 1837, only a few houses belonging to men like Sibley and Faribault existed in the territory where Chief Flatnose, Sleepy Eyes, and Wahanoton ruled as monarchs. Is it all gone? Clement wondered, of the tribes of the frontier. Whatever became of my young bride and daughter? Is my family and heritage lost? He put his sourness away for a practical question. Is there any connection to the Order of Eos I should be aware of? Clement asked as the wooden-hulled side wheel steamer pulled into the port. On the contrary, the Faroese likely despised the Scots, especially the Sinclairs. Clement smirked. How fortunate. Yes, Lord Erskine could have booked passage on several ships to various locations in America, but divine providence put us on the Volga. Divine providence. The words resonated with Clement. He hadn't known religion until he met Nicolette. God didn't exist in the violent hunting campgrounds along the Hudson Bay, and even in the serene Blackfoot Lakota camp at the base of Bear Mountain, it remained an abstract concept for Clement. Nicolette, however, pointed out God to him during their expedition to the headwaters of the Mississippi River. With a wink and a grin, each coincidence and stroke of good luck was seen as affirmation. Divine providence. Is this more of the same? Clement wondered and turned to Morgan for clarification. So why do the Faroese despise the Sinclairs? Morgan lit up. You do understand my theory about the Knoyan account. Mm-hmm. 8 survivors came out of North America after being lost for 20 years. I got it. The 8 survivors found a way back home in 1364, and then all but vanished from history. Until I found the Forsberg ruin, it's difficult to speculate how the news was received by either the Church or the Order of Eos. I do know what happened a generation later. Here in the Faroe Islands, Morgan shrugged. No, first the Sinclair family rose to power. Henry Sinclair was born in 1345, a generation after Scottish independence. Through marriage, he became the Jarl of Orkney and Baron of Roslin. By 1379, he became Admiral of the Scottish fleet. And this is after you believe Eos sent colonists to America? Clement clarified. Yes, when Knoyan returned in 1364, the Sinclair family learned their colonization plan had failed. With his newfound might, Admiral Sinclair invaded the Faroe Islands in 1391. Revenge, Clement noted. Indeed. It's what I thought too, but the more I pondered the idea, as we followed the same course, the more I realized what Admiral Sinclair needed. And what did he need? An eyewitness. Knoyan fled with Forsberg deep into Swedish territory for a good reason, didn't he? He was being hunted by Admiral Sinclair. The invasion of the Faroe Islands served little political or commercial purpose, but if he was searching for information about the American colony, it would allow him to return. At the Sinclair family chapel at Roslin, there are references to a trip made by his son, Henry Sinclair II, who, following the Faroe Island invasion, traveled to America in 1398, if the tale can be believed. A search and rescue mission. Yes. In 1401, though, the English invaded the Orkney Islands, killing Admiral Sinclair and ending all opportunities for Sinclairs. The rest is ancient history. Antoine Clement shook his head at how convoluted the Sinclair story had been since meeting Professor Morgan. It was no wonder Stuart put the two of them together. Is there something you'd like to share? Morgan asked. Heritage does matter, Clement agreed, thinking of the Sinclairs he knew as a boy. The sins of the father, as they say. Yes, the sins of the father, Clement agreed. My father was a brute. He taught me how to kill, and I spent my childhood trying to be as tough as he was. He was a Cajun from Louisiana, and when he learned how much money could be made in trapping, he went up the Mississippi, trapping as he went. Eventually, he found himself in a management position, which brought him all the way to Hudson Bay. There, he married my mother, a Cree woman. When she died, my father couldn't be burdened with raising a child, so he sent me to my aunt, also a Cree woman. At Oxford House, I was raised beside other white children, my cousins apparently, who were all named Sinclair. Morgan gasped. Wait, does that mean? Clement nodded. It's why Stuart gave you to me. Someone at Oxford House knew where my father, Antoine Clement, moved after leaving Hudson Bay. They gave the address to my father's killer. When we reach America, I'll find out which Sinclair gave the order if I have to kill every last one of them. Chapter 22. The Port of Torshavn, 1852. Sophus Nielsen had missed his previous chances. I'm not going to miss my opportunity this time. Despite his discomfort, he hid amongst the wet anchor ropes that secured the transatlantic steamship to the docks. From his narrow vantage point, he watched the passengers disembark and spread out into the town for shopping and dining. He'd seen this routine his entire life, But this time was different. Today, everything changes. He set his rifle down and grabbed the small chest also hidden amongst the ropes. Already waiting on the docks were crates of dried salmon to be loaded into the cargo hold. He slipped the steel knife from its sheath and pried at the corner of the closest salmon crate. Finally, the nails gave way enough for him to use his hands to open the lid. He turned, waited, and watched to see if he'd been spotted. Then he tossed several fillets of salmon aside to make room for his wooden chest, and then used the hilt to pound the nails back into place. Content, he crept back to his hiding place. The rifle was important to him as his right hand. At 16, he was as tall as a man, but was thin and lanky. He'd never be able to win a physical fight, so he needed the weapon in the days ahead. He carefully removed the rifle strap from the rear clasp, wrapped it around his torso, and then tightly resecured it so that it rested across his back. Now, I just have to wait for the right time. The port was the most exciting part of Nielsen's existence, and it was only an artificial pier. He'd grown to hate his home. From the long winter days to the windy summer days, he couldn't bear another year. Almost half of the population of the islands lived near the port, leeching off the visitors each day. He didn't want to be a cook, he didn't want to work at the docks, and he didn't want to risk his life fishing each day. He was one of 6 boys, and only his older brother Matthias could inherit the family farm. So that's not that Sophus wanted it. It's now or never. Sophus flexed his fingers, shaking them vigorously as to bring as much blood to them as he could. Then, with no one watching him, he inverted like a monkey in the African jungle. He held onto the thick rope and locked his ankles around it, flexing like a caterpillar as he risked the dangerous passage over the water between the dock and the ship. Damn it. Once he reached the metal of the ship, his rifle tip clanked loudly against the hull, and he froze. Hugging the rope even tighter, he maneuvered a slight spin until his right hand could clasp the opening in the side of the ship. Only a few inches around the rope existed, but he'd studied the situation prior to attempting it, and using the side of the ship for leverage, he shakily stood upon the rope like a circus performer. Once standing, he could reach the edge of the ship railing, and his wiry arms were not very strong, but luckily he didn't weigh much either, and he found just enough strength to lift himself up and over the railing and aboard the USS Volga. His schemes took him no farther. Now he had to improvise. He scooted over to the life rafts, unstrapped his rifle, and tucked it next to the oars. Only if the ship sunk would someone find his prize. Now, act like you belong. He took out a piece of paper he'd found the previous week, a boarding pass. A passenger dropped it in the market, and he snatched it up and kept it. Granted, it was for a previous ship, a previous day, and another cruise line, but from the docks, he'd studied how passengers used the piece of paper to get their bearings. Like a confused passenger, he glanced down at the paper as he walked to the stairs. Inside the passenger level, he knew better than to simply claim a room. Instead, he found a public restroom and locked himself inside. There he remained, unchallenged, for the next several hours. At the ship's horn sounding, he knew it was safe for him to step out for a minute. When the ships left port, passengers traditionally gathered around the railing to wave goodbye to passengers. Sophus Nielsen stood at the railing and waved goodbye to his home. I can't actually believe this worked. It was a brazen move for a stowaway, to be sure, but he did it with confidence and smiled. And a smile. The ship was loaded with passengers from Europe, and after confirming there were no Faroese travelers, he had an opportunity to rub elbows with the real passengers. He moved position several times along the rail as the big ship slowly maneuvered from the docks. One family traveled with a young teenage girl, and he flashed his dimpled grin before following her. "Hello, I'm Sophus. I'm bound for Boston." "We're all bound for Boston," she said dismissively. "And after, I'm heading to the Great Lakes to see if the stories are true. What about you?" We're going to a place called Cleveland. My father builds railroads. Ah, my father catches fish. If you ever visit the Minnesota Territory, ask for Sophus Nielsen. I'll have the grandest farm in the area." He left her with a nod. She made small talk with a few other passengers and then vanished. 2 days later, he emerged from his hiding place, acting like he belonged. In truth, he was starving, but he found a copy of James Fenimore Cooper's The Pathfinder in the lounge, and Natty Bumppo became his traveling companion. He fell in love with the damsel Mabel Dunham, who spoke with the same voice as Miss Cleveland, and later he fell in love with the inland sea named Lake Ontario. He pictured himself, hunting rifle in hand, guiding maidens across the wilderness. Some days he sat at a table, not even reading, but instead flipping pages as he listened to other passengers talk. His favorites quickly became Lord Erskine, his valet Antoine, and Professor Morgan. The professor never shut up about Norse legends, which intrigued Sophus. Life on the Faroe Islands shut down for the winter, and tales were told that had been handed down through the generations. Hearing new tales made the passage, and even his hunger, entirely tolerable. One evening, Professor Morgan explained his theory on why the Vikings first focused on traveling east up rivers like the Volga, Rhine, and Danube, and in later centuries westward to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. If the theories about the lost continent are true, whether you subscribe to Atlantis, Thule, or Hyperborea as a name, then this Norse bloodline didn't evolve into great sailors. They began as great sailors. The random nature of invasion seemed to be more akin to searching than conquering. So, what were they searching for? Lost treasure, Sophus surmised, hoping the theory was true. The men retired to their cabins, still discussing theories, with Lord Erskine and Professor Morgan talking so loudly that Sophus could hear them debating as he passed. It so excited him that he slipped out of one of his 6 hiding places, this time the life jacket closet, to sit down in the hallway, book in hand, to read by the light of the hallway and eavesdrop. The men were now talking about Baghdad and Jerusalem, which Sophus knew as the heart of the Holy Lands. What if King Solomon found the secret knowledge from antiquity? It seems obvious he had the means and the interest, Professor Morgan said. Once news reached the shores of Scandinavia, courtesy of the Romans, they woke with a motivation to acquire what had been lost. Or stolen from them, Erskine suggested. Look at the evolution of the Viking into European kings. They came out of the fjords and left their descendants in each royal family. Look at the Normans and Rollo. Later families pushed for the Great Crusade. What if the Crusaders found something in Jerusalem? The Templar treasure? Lord Erskine asked. Think of it, Lewis. What made the Northmen do an about-face? They found something in Solomon's treasure vault that led them to seek America. Lewis. Sophus had listened enough in public to know the name Lord Wesley Erskine and his valet, Antoine Clement, who slept in the next cabin. Professor Morgan was speaking to only one man. A secret identity? So who is he? And what is he hiding? From the creak on the floorboard, he could tell the men stood. So rather than using his "I'm just reading" trick, he retreated. When he rounded the corner, however, another stood in his way. At first, Sophus grinned. Then a strong hand took hold of his shirt. He tried to squirm, but only managed to pull the intruder out of the darkness. He noticed the boy's red hair. Moment before, a strong fist smashed into his face, and everything went black. This is the end of part 3.